For this project, we're going to focus on the element of shape, as well as learn the basics of the Adobe Photoshop program, how to use layers, how to cut, and how to paste. So some very important skills that you would need to get an understanding of how to use Photoshop. To touch on the shape requirements here, we're going to make a design called a Japanese Notan. A Japanese Notan is a design that uses positive and negative shape in an interesting way to create a design or work of art. I'm going to read here from the assignment. Artists use many ideas in their work. When they create images, they often think about composition or where to place elements on the canvas. Some artists might be inspired by the idea of the Japanese art form based on the elements of light and dark. It's a concept called Notan. Notan is a term that refers to the Japanese idea of balancing light and dark areas in a composition. One of the most familiar symbols illustrating this concept is the circular yin and yang form from Eastern philosophy. Perhaps you've seen it before, the round image with interconnecting teardrop-like shapes, one white and one black. If you think about the yin-yang, right, they're opposites, right, the white and black, and the white side has a black dot in it, the black side has a white dot in it. It's exactly opposite. That's exactly what you want to achieve in a Notan, is that type of balance. So what we do is we start with a shape. It can be a square, which is what we're going to start with, or it could be a circle or any other shape, but we're going to start with a square, and we're going to cut that shape. We're going to cut out of the positive square and flip the shape into the negative space to create an interesting design. We're going to start in Adobe Photoshop, and I'm going to show you how we can set that up. But first, a few more samples of ones that I had created. Here's another example of one that I created. It's cut up so much that you can almost barely identify the original square where it started, but there was a square in the composition. And then what I did was I drew designs into the outside, touching the edges, and cut out of the positive and flipped it out into the white negative space. A second design here. Same concept. This one you can see the square a little bit more. The square started out totally black. Then by cutting out pieces of it and flipping those black pieces into the white, we create a balanced design with pieces coming off of each of the sides here, where we are, it's interesting because then the white on the black inside of the square is the positive, but on the outside of the square it's the opposite. The black on white is the positive. So let's get started, and I'll show you how we can set up our canvas. To open Adobe Photoshop, you can either click your Adobe Creative Cloud icon on the desktop. It looks like a rainbow with a C and a C kind of interlocked, or you can come down to the corner and just type in Photoshop, which is what I like to do. Click on the version of Photoshop that you have. Sometimes it will have a dialog box asking you about what size, if you want to create a new project, what size you want to make it. I'm going to click Create New, and we have some options here. Okay, so notice here it says we can measure by different units. So we can have pixels, inches, centimeters. For this particular project, we're going to use pixels, and we're just going to do 2000 pixels by 2000 pixels, because that's going to make us a nice square canvas, right? If it's 2000 tall and 2000 wide, height and width, then it is going to be a perfect square. For resolution, I'm going to put 300 right here, and then I'm going to press Create. As I mentioned, notice the canvas that has been generated is a perfect square. Just to tell you a little bit about Photoshop here, we have tools on our left-hand side. These are things we can use to manipulate the canvas. On the right-hand side, we have a Layers tab. Layers are basically, you can think of it as a blank sheet of paper. If I go right here and press this little plus mark, it says create a new layer. What I've basically done here is I have a white piece of paper, you can see on the bottom, that says background. It's locked, meaning I cannot make any changes to it. And by pressing new layer, I've created another piece of paper on top of that paper. It's a little bit of an abstract concept, but what happened is there's actually a clear piece of paper on top of the white piece of paper that prevents me from making changes to the bottom white background, which is what we want. When you see this little checkerboard effect here in the preview, that's the computer's way of telling you that it's clear. There's no real way to show clear as a color, so this is the way that the computer does that. On this layer here, what I'm going to do is create my initial square that we're going to cut out of. So if I go up here to my rectangular marquee tool, I'm going to go on my square, and I want to make it about a third of the way in each direction. Don't worry about getting it perfectly in the center yet, because we'll center it up after the fact. But if I hold down the shift key, notice it's going to allow me to make a perfect square now. And I'm going to again make it about 1/3 of the height and 1/3 of the width of my canvas. I let go. Now I want to put a color in there. It could be any color, but I'm going to use black for now. The paint bucket tool, sometimes it's hidden. If you see this little arrow next to a tool, then you know there are additional tools hidden underneath it. I pressed the letter G, which is just the shortcut here for paint bucket. If I click and hold on what's the gradient tool right now, I have my paint bucket tool hidden there. Another way you can preview all of the tools is if you click this 3 little dots down here, edit toolbar, and you can see all of the possible tools that you can add and customize. So let's say I wanted my paint bucket to be there. I could drag it into this column, hit done, and then I also have a paint bucket in here. I'm going to dump my square black. And lastly, now I just want to get my square in the middle of my canvas. Control and D means deselect. I deselected the square. I'm going to go to my move tool, the top option, and I'm going to center it. Notice these purple guides that come up. They're just telling me that I'm perfectly centered with my canvas. Now I have a perfectly set up Notan here that I can draw into and cut to create my final design, right? I have, again, my square. You want to double check this, that your square is on its own clear layer, which is above the white layer or background. This is very important because in order to be able to cut it and not cut the background as well, the square needs to be on its own layer. So moving on now to the Notan design. The beauty of the Notan is that this is something you could do traditionally with a black piece of paper and a white piece of paper and a pair of scissors, but I found that it's an awesome project where you can really learn the tools of Adobe Photoshop, how to work with layers, how to work with tools, how to cut and paste. So I have my pressure sensitive drawing stylus hooked up, something that I'll show you how to do here in class, and I'm going to show you how we can do a little bit of cutting. To cut into our square, I'm going to show you a couple tools. If we go over here to the lasso tool, click and hold, there's a couple options. You have your regular lasso tool, which will allow you to draw organic kind of shapes, more free-flowing. Or you have the polygonal lasso, which will allow us to draw more geometric straight edge kind of shapes. One of the contrasts that we talked about in the presentation. So first, let me take the lasso tool. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, Control and plus, just to get up in there. And what I want to do when I draw a shape is start from the edge and work my way in. and I'm going to make a nice organic kind of shape. So I'm going to go for something that looks kind of like a plant maybe. I have a jade plant on my desk, and this looks kind of what it looks like. The thing kind of has a free-flowing aspect to the growth that it has. The important thing with the shape is to always close the shape, and we want to start and end always off of the edge of the square, and I'll show you why. Notice it has that dotted kind of line, the thing that's moving. That is kind of showing us our selection now. What we want to do is cut out of the square and then paste onto a new layer. So in order to do that, you know about copy and paste, Control C and Control V, but we want to cut. So the shortcut for cut is Control and X. Notice what happened there is it actually cut out of the square layer. If I look at the little preview now on the right hand side, you'll notice that little cutout, if you can barely make it out, is actually cut out of the square. If I press Control and V, you see what happened there is it created a new layer here. I can even go on my new layer and write plant, just so I remember what it is. The problem is the plant, if you see where its location is, it's black and it's on top of the black square, so it's here somewhere. If I go over here to the layers panel and check this little eyeball on my square layer, I can now see where my plant is. So the little eyeball hides a layer. So I'm going to move my plant out to the side. I'm going to recheck the eye here for my square layer. So you can see I cut the plant out of the square, and here is the subsequent piece that's cut out. Next, what I want to do is actually flip this piece so that the edge of the square acts like a mirror. In order to mirror this piece, I have to make sure I'm on the layer with the plant, edit, transform, and I want to flip vertically. I'm going to flip it so it's below the initial cutout. I'm then going to perfectly align my pieces, and this is the basic idea of the Notan. Each of the edges acts as a mirror to flip the positive shape cut from the square. I'm sorry, the negative is then flipped out here to become positive on the white negative. I can even use my little arrow keys and align my plant until it's perfect. When you go to make your next cut, very important step is that you go back to your layers and always make sure that you cut from your square. So each time you make a cut, you go from the square layer. This time, I'm going to use my polygon lasso tool, and I'm going to come in from a different edge. We want to maintain balance in our design, meaning we want to have elements hanging off of each of the sides to create a nice balanced artwork. I messed up a little there. Just hit backspace if you don't like what you have, and you can always restart. Always close the shape, starting and ending off the edge. Control X to cut. Control V paste. Again, I think my piece is hidden. If I uncheck the eyeball on the square layer, I can grab my little lightning bolt. And these shapes don't necessarily have to look like anything right now. We're just feeling it out at first. When I flip this one, this time I'm going to choose Edit Transform, and I'm going to choose Flip Horizontally since I'm going side to side. Horizontal means this direction. Vertical means up and down, right? So I flip horizontally and align to my original cut. As you get going, there's so many fancy things you can do to create the different shape contrasts that we talked about. One interesting thing is you can use this feature called feather up here to create a soft shape, something like a cloud kind of feel. So if I feather it by 5 pixels, what it's going to do is take my selection that I draw. Let's say I do something like this. It can just be any kind of shape for right now. When I press cut, always making sure I'm on my square layer, notice how the edge has a softness to it. So that's another interesting contrast. What we're attempting to do here is build in as many layers of contrast, as many shape contrasts as we possibly can into our design to create a lot of interest. Edit, transform, flip horizontal. When making this, there's a lot of cool things we can do. One of which is we can kind of incorporate images into our artwork that are a little bit more realistic, maybe even using a reference. However, we want to be careful. Don't use anything that's copyrighted. Don't use anything that's anybody else's work, including things like logos you'd want to leave out of your artwork. However, I'll show you how we can find a picture and maybe make something out of it. One example here, I just Googled sunglasses. Here's a picture of a guy. Sometimes it'll let you copy and paste it over. Sometimes you might have to open it in Photoshop. But let's try this. Copy and paste. What I want to do is use him as a reference to trace over. What I'm going to do is bring him. Actually, let's resize first. Control and T is the shortcut for free transform. What that means is it gives you these little handles where you can drag it smaller. Because I always have to start and end at the edge of the artwork, I'm going to try to align him where he starts off the edge of the square and then cuts in to the square. What I'm going to do, put him underneath the square, and I'm going to obviously have to cut out of the square. So on the square layer where it says opacity, I'm going to lower the opacity enough where I can see through the square slightly. What I did here was carefully select areas of the man's features that I want to be the part that gets cut out. I traced around the glasses. I traced around his nose and things like that. The way you do that is if you hold down shift, you can make multiple selections at a time. So in here, maybe I want to go and give the glasses like a second shape. Let's see, it didn't take that one. Oh, because I'm cutting inside of a shape, I have to actually press alternate, which subtracts from a shape, and I'm going to take away part of the selection. So I can cut a hole inside. Again, that is also creating a negative shape inside of a positive shape. If I press X, always making sure I'm on the square layer, cut, Control X. That looks real weird right now, but ready? There we go. Control V to paste. If you ever do something and you don't like it, you can press Control and Z as the shortcut for undo. Bring the opacity of my square back up. And I'm going to click on this guy, edit, transform, flip horizontally. And that's how you can use something as a reference to make something a little bit more realistic, if that's something you're into. The idea is we want to try to fill up the entire canvas here. Rather, try to cut apart the entire original square. Again, if I hold shift, I can make multiple selections. If I hold alternate, you can take away from a selection. So you can create an interesting combination. You can cut holes in your selection. As you go, it gets harder and harder to cut more shapes because you have to find shapes that fit with what you already have. You're going to have to get some long, skinny shapes in there. You want to have a variety of shapes, meaning long, skinny shapes, fat shapes, active and static, soft and hard shapes, right? To kind of cut up the whole shape and finish out the Notan. And by the end, you'll have an awesome design, just like the ones that I showed you. So good luck. Let me know if you have any questions. Again, you can always reference these tutorials if you want to go back and see how something's done.